name's Antonia, and as Regina just said, I'm one of the founders and the director of this nonprofit organization, Educate. And I'm here because one of the other wonderful members of our team, Andrea, who works at Gracenote, connected me to this team organizing these talks, streaming things. And really excited to be able to share a little bit of my story and the story of the organization, and a little bit about what we do and what it's been like going through this process of growing a nonprofit as a young woman throughout my studies here in the Netherlands and also in Honduras. So I'm 24 now, and my story as it relates to Educate more or less starts when I was 18 and I moved to Honduras to spend a year working there at a US-funded orphanage, working with ex-street children. And I was working sort of on the outskirts of a city called El Progreso. I think sort of urban, dusty palm trees and old yellow school buses, that kind of vibe. And at the time, Honduras was the murder capital of the world. So at the time, it had the highest homicide rate of any country outside of a war zone. So my parents were not particularly pleased that this is where I'd chosen to spend a year. But it was a fascinating place to learn about, some of which, obviously, that side of things from a reasonably safe distance. And that experience of spending a year living and working in Honduras, I tend to point out two that experience shapes in me that led to the founding of this organization, Educate. And the first of those is seeing the vast inequalities in the education sector in Honduras. According to the World Bank, Honduras has the highest economic inequality in Latin America. And for a bit of context, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. So this gap between rich and poor was absolutely vast. And for the children that I was working with, for the young people that I was friends with outside of work, who were ordinary working class people and families, the idea of like going to university was just completely off the cards. And it's infuriating to work closely with these people and to be friends with people who are just so systematically marginalized, and getting to see that there is such a structural lack of opportunities for people if you're from the wrong side of that divide. And then the second thing was experiencing the unequal, very top-down models and unequal power relationships of the nonprofit sector. So like I said, I was working at the time at a US-funded orphanage, and because they were American, they were able to get away with things that there's no way they would be able to get away with in their own country, because of these power relationships that are very sort of neo-imperial, neo-colonial structures. And so around where I was living, there would be things like church groups coming in and spending. There was a church that they spent $1 million on building in a community that already had a church. And so then you have this huge fancy building that these foreigners have decided this local community needs, that's completely empty. Or there was another case of a village on the other side of the city, El Progreso, called San Jorge, which was a noticeably very poor, rough area. And this American guy came down and saw how people lived here and all that, and decided to build houses for some of the families from this place, San Jorge, in a different part of the city, which happened to be a few villages down from where I was. And so this was a few years before I had moved there. So he built these new houses, moved some of the families from the San Jorge into this new area. And what he didn't realize when he was doing that was that San Jorge was a Mara 18 gang center. And so by moving these families into a different part of the city, he spread all this gang influence into a whole another sector. And at the time, this wasn't affecting where I was living, but now that influence has spread several areas along, and the graffiti that marks their territory is now very commonplace in the sector where I lived and still spend time when I go back. And so seeing both of these things, these situations that could so easily have been avoided if people had taken the time to listen and prioritize local knowledge and local leadership, and really critically question, their own intentions. I think for a lot of foreigners, often also deeply rooted racism in the having the audacity to come in with your own ideas and try and shape projects according to what you think rather than what communities actually need. And so those two sides of my experience in Honduras shaped what Educates grew into. And obviously, a year is not a hugely long time. I don't claim and never claimed that that I was. I lived there for a year initially, and it was long enough that I was able to build up, very strong friendships with people, to really get to know the place in all of its seasons and states, and to see also that these problems that Honduras suffers from were in no way character flaws or faults of people. They were very structurally imposed, systematic issues imposed by neoliberal, neo-imperialist regimes. And at the time, I was really into Michael Moore documentaries. I don't know if anyone here knows Michael Moore, but I remember in one of his films that I watched during that time with a friend of mine, he says that something along the lines of that he doesn't want his films to make people sad. He wants them to make people angry, because anger leads to action. What happened for me is that I was angry and am angry at the state of affairs in Honduras, and frankly in a lot of the world, where systems just aren't working and opportunities aren't equal. And that anger and frustration led me and friends to starting this, and to try to believe that there was a better way for this work to be done, and for education to be promoted, and there were people that we wanted to work alongside in order to do that. And so that's how Educate started. It wasn't necessarily me, wanting to be a leader in anything. And I was trying to think, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, of the idea of being a woman in leadership and a woman founder and all of that, and absolutely that's part of my sort of identity. For sure, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. But Educate really started out of a frustration and a desire to work on this cause with people that I'd met during that time. And so we started Educate in 2017, and that sounds very straightforward. It was 8 months of paperwork and bureaucracy and trying to jump through all the different loopholes and checkpoints that you have to go through to start up an organization like this. But we did it, and now we're a grassroots nonprofit working alongside local communities in Honduras to empower children and young people through supporting community-driven initiatives focused on education. And so there's sort of two parts of our work right now. We have a scholarship program that supports high potential young people in continuing their education after university. After high school in university. And we also work with communities to support community-driven projects, like starting school-based community libraries and nutrition programs, and things that sort of fundamentally transform learning environments for young people in these areas. And really importantly, throughout all of it, is this community-driven development approach that allows communities to form their own leadership committees of teachers and students and parents and other members of the community. And then they are the ones who plan the project and lead its implementation. Even, if they fundraise a small portion of each project cost. And we are there to facilitate and to support and to act more as a catalyst than as a leader. And we've seen over the past 3 years that we've been working, that this really has, it allows this real ownership over projects and initiatives to take place. And the impact and sustainability that leads to is incredibly powerful to witness. And it's been amazing to support some of these people who really know and deeply understand what their communities need and how best they can implement projects in their own communities. And so Educate, when it first started up, there were 3 of us, and then a few months later we grew into 5, and we were all young women, and we were all friends at university. And I think because we were all women, and we were all young. Being a young woman never seemed to matter at all, because that was our whole team. That was everyone. We were all sort of in the same demographic. And I also was, very lucky to grow up in a family of very strong women. My dad was a stay-at-home dad, and my mum was a school director, and is very excited that I was going to talk about being a woman founder and all this. So I was lucky to have those kinds of role models. And so at the time, certainly at the beginning of Educate, it didn't feel in any way that this was something that I shouldn't be doing, or that it was in any way questionable. But in Honduras, being a woman, I think, always has felt like it matters a bit more. Obviously, like as in a lot of Latin American countries, you have a very present culture of machismo, and much more overt sort of subjugation of women in society, and a lack of representation of women in leadership positions and all those kinds of things, and often a lot more overt than you would see, for example, in Amsterdam. And I think really key in Honduras, as I was saying, it's was the murder capital of the world at the time that I first moved there, and still is very, very high in its homicide rankings. And it has, in Honduras, there's one femicide every 16 hours. So the gender-based is extremely, extremely high and extremely severe, and a huge, threat for a lot of women to live under. The UN has said that since 2014, 95% of cases of sexual violence and femicide in Honduras haven't even been investigated. So for Honduran women, that is absolutely a very different situation than it is for me, even in Honduras. So I think thinking about being a woman as a director of Educate in Honduras is definitely different than it is here, but it's still different from the situation that my Honduran female friends live in. And I always sort of say that, you have these statistics of 95% of cases not even investigated of Honduran women, but I'm absolutely sure that if I was to be killed, that would be a very, very different situation. And so that's a huge protection as a foreigner, as a white person, as a white woman in Honduras. So I'm absolutely held to different standards than my female friends and colleagues in Honduras. And I also think it's important to note in Honduras, because of this situation of extreme violence, that young men are often pushed into these violence youth gangs. And so the way that machismo affects, I think, particularly young urban poor men, is also something that is amplified through this environment of extreme violence. And working in this kind of environment as a nonprofit, I think even though our mission is not explicitly gender focused, we absolutely take gender into account in the work that we do in a whole lot of different ways. Obviously, I was saying we have the scholarship program. So at the moment, we're supporting 3 students in that. And 2 of them are young women, and both of them are studying in STEM fields. So one of them is in her 3rd year of studying medicine. The other one is in her 2nd year of industrial engineering. And both of them are first-generation high school graduates and their families, and obviously the first to go on to university. And they very much recognize in themselves that they are breaking barriers and changing norms and taking up spaces in these classes that are very male-dominated fields still. And so to be able to support them, I think, is something incredibly important, because it's fostering that that creation of local leaders and young people who are going on and being able to follow their passions in spite of whatever odds these young women have faced in getting to where they are. And seeing that they recognize that in themselves, and they talk about that. Our students go back to their high schools and primary schools to give talks to younger students, and this is something that is very important to them. And so it's great to be able to see that they are fostering that discussion about what it means to be a young Honduran woman, which is a discussion that I can't have with young Honduran women, because I'm simply don't have the same experience. And then in our library projects, we again also comes into what kind of books do we choose to put into these spaces? What kind of stories do we want to be giving children? And there's one girl in a school that we've been working with, where we started a library this past summer, and she absolutely loves the book The Paper Bag Princess, which is this book about a princess who's going to marry this prince, and then the prince gets taken by a dragon, and she goes and saves him. And then at the end of the book, she decides not to marry him after all because she doesn't want to. And it's a great story, and she has been doing all these projects about it. She turned it into a play. She did a book report on it, and it's cool to see that, you know, these girls up in these really remote villages in Honduras are reading these stories and seeing characters that they can admire and can respect and look up to. And so having books in our libraries that have those sort of strong female characters and that talk explicitly or implicitly about gender equality and gender norms and is something that is really important, I think. So starting a library is one thing, but starting a library that can promote different values and that can challenge students and communities as well is something valuable, and you know, that has definitely been an example of that. And the third point that I wanted to raise in terms of how we, you know, take gender into account in our work in Honduras is male role models. We actually have in Amsterdam, we're majority female team. In Honduras, it's majority male. But we have some young guys. There's a young guy called Walter in particular, who's our project coordinator, and he led his village through starting a library and is now coordinates and works with multiple other villages in supporting them. And having young people like him on board who are also acting as role models, as our scholarship students are for younger students, in breaking down norms and expectations about what it means to be a man and what masculinity is and involves or should involve, is also something that I think is really has an impact far beyond anything that you can sort of quantify. So that's Honduras. And meanwhile in Amsterdam, I think as we've grown as an organization and as we've shifted sort of from being a project run by friends to an organization really run by a team, I personally feel that I've sort of had to grow a lot as a leader as we've you know had more people. I've had to step into a role that's a bit more explicit leadership rather than being more of a casual coordinator and just making sure that things are running. And as that process has happened, I think being a woman has started to matter more, both to myself and apparently also to others. And I was thinking about a meeting that I had about a year ago now, but with a guy about a potential partnership between the nonprofit and his organization. And he kept calling Educate a sweet project, which I'm absolutely certain he would never have said if I was a guy. And when I brought a male colleague along to our next meeting, his tone suddenly changed completely, which you know both pissed me off and was kind of nice, because it meant that I was right and that he was treating me differently because I was a woman, and this was completely unjustified. And those kinds of encounters make it clear that it absolutely is different being a woman, and I think also being a young woman. Going into those kinds of encounters and those kinds of meetings, you definitely are perceived differently. And you know, we're now a team of I think 26 in between Amsterdam and Honduras, plus a couple more other volunteers. And as we've reached sort of those larger numbers, and as I've had to be more, as I was saying, of a leader rather than a coordinator, I've definitely started to question myself a lot more as well, and my ability to lead a team, my intelligence, whether whether in some ways I might be imposing the same kinds of neo-colonial power relationships that I want to avoid so desperately, or whether, you know, I'm making the right decisions about things. And some of it is sort of like existential questions of, does this work even matter? But some of it is absolutely comes from an insecurity that I think is in many ways learned in the ways that I've been socialized as female. And in line with that, I a few months ago signed up to pitch at a women's pitch event for startups, and I was going to be one of 8 women pitching their organizations, and I practiced and I really prepared for it. And on the morning of the event, I almost didn't go because I was so nervous, because I kept, you know, saying these things to myself that, you know, I wasn't really a founder, I was a co-founder, and I wasn't really just me, it was this whole team. And you know, it was held in this really fancy lawyer building, and in all the pictures of past events, everyone was wearing blazers, and it was all very fancy. And and I the only reason I went was because I was frankly too embarrassed to pull out at the last minute. So I went along and didn't tell anyone I knew that I was going, didn't tell any of the team, because I was sure that I was going to absolutely, yeah, make an absolute fool of myself, and just didn't want anyone I knew to be there to see it. And what ended up happening is that I actually came in second place in this pitch competition, and met really wonderful people, and people were really interested in what I had to say, because I, you know, was a nonprofit founder, and most people there were startup business of sharing experiences. And I'm so glad that I went. Um, and it was again one of those moments of having to remind myself that I have set up something along with other people that is valuable and that does have some worth to it. But I think as women, there is a tendency to question oneself a lot more than a guy probably would in the same situation. And even to say, look, that I do feel that I've set up something that is valuable, feels a little bit forward and uncomfortable to say outright. Um, but overall, I think that, you know, I, having grown into this sort of position of being a young female leader of a nonprofit, is something that's happened for me quite organically. It's not a position I ever, you know, stepped into. It's something that's happened slowly over the past 3 years as Educate has grown. And it's happened because I care very deeply about the work that we do, and I care about, you know, justice in the educational sector and people's rights to pursue the things that they want to pursue. And I feel very privileged to work with amazing people in this, all sort of united in this goal of promoting education, and doing that in a way that is led by the communities who are ultimately benefiting from the projects.